So now I'll talk to you about Price-Anderson. This is the only reason nuclear was able to happen in this country. If there hadn't been this act passed in 1957, we would not have nuclear at all in this country, because the insurance industry said the actuary said, this is just too risky. This is something we will not insure, we'll never insure. And if you read your homeowner's policy, it clears all homeowners' policies. This is for cars, automobiles, businesses, anything. It excludes it. It says, this policy shall not apply to any loss, damage, or expense due to or arising out of, directly or indirectly, nuclear reaction, radiation, or radioactive contamination, regardless of how it was caused. So, you know, if you don't own a home, but your parents do, or somebody else you know owns a home, and they have a mortgage, which most people do, if, as Marilyn said, there was an accident, we had to evacuate, we would still be responsible for paying our mortgages, and we couldn't get any coverage, insurance policy coverage. So the way Price-Anderson works, because once again, the insurance industry has said, forget about it, we're not going to get involved, and to this day they still say, we're not going to get involved. The reason it happened was they said, we need this, we're an infant industry, you know, nobody will insure us, we don't really know, we need this support, we need this government bailout, we need this, you know, basically socialized risk. We're going to socialize the risk of nuclear, and we're going to lay it on the public. Because if there's no insurance, what happens at the end of the day, if there is an accident, who's going to have to pay for it? Us. Either we're going to pay for it directly, or Congress is going to force us to pay. So the way Price-Anderson works is, because they realized they couldn't have no insurance, people would go, oh, forget it, they would never get it passed at all. So what they did was they set up this, what they call the Price-Anderson Insurance Fund. And the way it works is each of the 104 plants in the country contributes $111.9 million per reactor. That's $12.2 billion. Okay, that's the total maximum insurance coverage. Now let's look at some numbers. Let's look at how much Chernobyl actually cost. $600 billion. How much 3 Mile Island, adjusted for inflation, is $400 billion. 9/11, $2 trillion. BP, $100 billion plus, counting, still counting. Fukushima to date, the last I've read, is about $250 billion, and clearly still counting. You know, one of the things that we've looked at is, okay, how does this balance with property values in the 50-mile radius? Because if there is an accident, the 50-mile radius is going to be impacted. So what is the actual property values in our area? And we went to all the assessors, and we found out that the property values in the New York region around Indian Point is $8.5 trillion. So there seems to be a real disproportional insurance problem there, because we're talking about only 1.5%. 0.15% is insured for this whole region. And what it really does is, because you socialize the risk, it means the risk takers, which are the operators and the NRC, they're not being held accountable for anything at all. Insurance companies, let's say car insurance companies, have now made it that you have to wear your seatbelt, right? They require, if you have a bad driving policy, your insurance goes up. Because there's no outside insurance on this, they are making choices on regulation that are not regulating. They're allowing endless exemptions from safety standards. They're not really actually doing their job. If you had a regulator who was acting as an insurer, who was actually protecting us, then we could say there's a balance. But what has happened, because there's no insurance, they say, oh, there's no insurance, we have no liability. Even if we do something that's grossly negligent, even if we do something that's really horrible, there's no liability against us, so let's take the risk. It's actually human nature. People are going to act like this. So you have an industry now that has gone rogue, basically. They've gone totally crazy because there's nobody watching them. They're basically a free-for-all. And our lives, property value, none of it is calculated in their process. So so what do we do about this? I mean, it's really unfortunate. Now, this was supposed to be a temporary thing to get the nuclear industry up and going. But Congress keeps renewing it and upping the amount, and not by very much. So we're only up to $12.2 billion as of today. This is until, Congress enacted this until 2026. all right? But now they're already talking about Price Anderson again. They want to re-up it again because they're talking about building new nuclear plants. And the relicensing, for example, at Indian Point, everyone calls it relicensing. And we think of it like you go in with your driver's license and you get a renewal and it's the same license. The reality is, under their own regulations, what it says is a new superseding license. It means it's a brand new license for another 20 years, except they exclude things like looking at population, evacuation, seismology. They exclude all these things that they'd have to do if there was a new license. But one of the things that we as the insurers, I think that's what we have to change the dialogue. We, the public, are the insurers of the nuclear industry. And so what has been happening is the NEI, the Nuclear Energy Institute, which is the biggest lobbying group in Washington, the NRC is beholden to them, and they act like they're the people that they have to please. But the question before is, how do we get to the NRC? We have to change the dialogue. It has to be that we're the insurers and the NRC has to answer to us.
That's right.
Period. They have to answer to us. We're the insurers. We want real safety regulations. We don't want exemptions on fire safety, so we have a 24 minutes between us and a meltdown at Indian Point right now. That's not acceptable. And we need to change this dialogue. Now, what's interesting, sadly, because of Fukushima and because of the energy, the economics today, there may be a way that we can leverage a right and left kind of coalition around this. Because, I don't think most of us here are Tea Party, but maybe some of us are. But I think the Tea Party would be very, very upset about knowing that we are insuring private industry. The other thing that changed when nuclear first started is all the original nuclear plants were public utilities. Now, at least 50%, in Indian Point for sure, is private. So I think if we can coalesce this and get in front of them and explain that basically we're insuring it, that there's not any liability, and they need to answer to us, we might be able to really, shift this around, and eliminate this. I think it's an opportunity for us. And I think, some of the things that we should be asking for is, first of all, a list of all the exemptions that they're granting to all the nuclear plants. This is not just an Indian Point issue. And we can focus it in on Indian Point, but this is a national problem about, nuclear plants. It's the only way they exist. And we should also be, requiring that if they aren't in compliance with their safety regulations, that they're shut down until their compliance is met. If you're in a building that has a safety violation, they would shut it down, make you fix it, and then you could go back in. That's not what happens at nuclear plants. They let them run to the ground, basically, with a lot of violations. They just exempt the violations. They don't call them violations. That's how they get around it. They say, oh, not a violation, it's an exemption. It's okay now. So as the insurers, we need to stand up, and I think that's something that we can really work on and maybe even get petitions out about, because I think we can cross the line with this.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Oh, and here, you pass it down. This is a summary that helped me understand it better.
Judy, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have two questions. You said that we would still have to pay the mortgage if something happens. What about taxes? We still have to pay property taxes?
Yes.
Even though we couldn't live in our homes?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure because I don't know how the property taxes would work. I don't know because if you're not using it. Yeah, sure.
But
Yeah,
you
sure.
own it. You own it.
You own it.
It's
You own it.
yours.
So you have the deed. Yeah.
No one would buy it.
Right. Exactly. That's true.
Okay, my other question is, you said that the current figure of Price Anderson is $12.2 billion. Okay, is that an annual? They have to contribute that annually or one time?
I didn't understand what that was.
Okay, that is a really interesting thing I forgot to mention. That money is not in a fund right now. You would think, they would have an insurance fund. That money will only be gathered from the different reactor owners after an accident happens. So, okay, that money, if that happens, and Congress has to demand it. So you can imagine all these nuclear plants going bankrupt suddenly and not having the money. We know that their decommissioning fund, for example, in Indian Point, was raped during this last downturn because the NRC let them put their decommissioning fund, a large portion of it, on the stock market and gamble on it, and they lost a lot of money. So we know that they actually don't have all the funding, and Marilyn is an expert on this issue about how much money Entergy really has or doesn't have, which, a lot of it is on paper, and they have multiple layers of corporations, so they can easily turn around and say, oh, Well, the one that's operating the plant no longer has any money, so
So
we're not
we're-
contributing, so too
so
bad.
it's
And,
yes.
and it's such a small amount in terms of the amount of damage, that even the 12.2 is a drop in the bucket. It's
Yes,
not
it
gonna
is.
really make a difference.
Well, Susan, I'd like to point out, you were one of the first to do a study about how much, what's the property value of this area, and it's in trillions. It's just really
8.5
unthinkable.
trillion.
Okay, Michelle, do you want to?
a question?
Yeah, the question about the banks, I know with hydrofracking, the banks are sort of backing off and saying, well, if you're allowing hydrofracking on your land, we're not sure we're gonna give you a mortgage. Aren't the banks, don't the banks have a lot of risk here too? Could we?
Yes, they do. They have enormous risk, because if we all get evacuated, we don't have jobs, we don't have a place to live. Yeah, what Price Anderson actually does is it puts the American economy on the brink of bankruptcy. That's what it does. It actually, it's the key to bankrupt our economy. And that's the key with the Tea Party people. If we can get them to understand that this is the only industry that has this, they're being treated differently than every other industry in this country. No other horrible polluter even gets this. This is a very unique situation. It's unequal protection under the law, partially, but it really is, you know, a unique situation. But yeah, it puts us on the edge of bankruptcy, because the banks will go under, because, yeah, you would think they'd be concerned, but everyone in the area has it. I mean, it's everywhere in the country.
Okay, thank you.